peace studies, postmodernism, and gender theories. All these theories are actually are part of the social theories, and they do focus on domestic and individual level of analysis. So if you're going to have like topics related, for example, to domestic influences in foreign policy, or you'll have to analyze I don't know, like civil wars, or you will have to analyze some issues like, for example, even the current situation with Israel and Palestine. If you will just look into the maybe some interest groups or leaders, you could actually apply these four theories to analyze the topics. So if we're talking about constructivism, first and foremost, what is characteristic for constructivism? They developed in late 80s, and they became increasingly influential after 1990s. Why did it happen so? Well, first and foremost, you have to look into the events which happened at the end of the 80s, and you could say, well, the changes that happened within the Soviet Union, and the disintegration of Soviet Union itself, those movements, the revolutionary movements in the Eastern Europe actually did not really allow the classic theories, even Marxism, to explain at that particular moment, to have a good explanation of those domestic influences, which led to so many changes. So from the constructivist perspective, we create and recreate a social world. So constructivism focuses on those social influences, and the people, or that human agency, according to constructivism, actually plays a major role into how the events are going to develop. One characteristic of constructivism is that it both overlaps with the liberalism and realism. So you have to understand that, I would say, technically what constructivism did, they did take, I would say, because they're focusing on norms and ideas, they did pay attention to the normative base analyzed by both theories, and they attempted to explain it in their own way, right? So for constructivism, the world of politics is very difficult to discuss. It's actually all the structure are coming like a natural thing. So each and every society actually can have their own experience of how exactly the things are going. So there are two main there are two main points that constructivism focuses on. First and foremost, the ideas, and secondly is the identity. So technically, if you're going to use the past papers to practice, you could give two characteristics of constructivism by simply explaining what do they mean by ideas and what do they mean by identity. So for constructivism, the ideas are first and foremost the values which would include deep moral convictions, whereby constructivism believed that people have their own concepts about the world and their own behavior actually would be motivated by the moral values. So you can see that this particular point is actually overlapping a lot with the liberal perspective. Constructivism also emphasizes on norms, on the role of norms in international relations. And for example, if you would have to explain or if you have to evaluate the role of United Nations or the role of international law, you could actually bring in, or say you could, you would choose to use a particular theory. You could bring in constructivism. So for constructivism, norms would govern those procedural and substantive terms of human behavior. The idea of people the idea is that the people are going to actually follow these norms, and they're going to create those norms in order to ensure that order order in the in the world system. In terms of identity, the identity for constructivism has different dimensions. So first and foremost, the identity for constructivism would include the comprehension of the individual about himself as a particular or a separate entity, and which could be constructed through a process of disclosure with the others. So this construction of identity is an interactive process, which means that it will always depend on the environment and the other identities which it gets into contact. So in terms of how the constructivism actually, we'll say, overlaps with the realism and liberalism, you could actually analyze, by using constructivism, you can analyze the let's say the norm of, well, the principle of anarchy, and you could also analyze, for example, the principle of reciprocity, right? So if you want to, well, according to constructivism, the world is, or say the system itself, there is a particular reason why the system might be anarchic, or why the system might be might have as a base, might have that interdependent or interdependent structure. So if according to constructivism, the identity itself could be a two-way process, and it always depends on what you put as part of the, or let's say at the base of this of the identity, or what is the background of the identity itself. So for instance, if the world system, according to constructivism, if the world system is the principles of the world system are based on the self-help, then the actors might have to expect that the further situation is going to lead to a preparation for war, or the actors are going to actually end up in a security dilemma, right? So, and if the actors would apply a principle of reciprocity at the base of their relations, then in this case, they might end up having an interdependent and peaceful world system. So for constructivism, it is important to ask the question why there were particular choices in terms of particular identity. What is the background? How particular, for example, societies would have, let's say, what is the, what would be the thinking, what would be the particular idea of a society regarding their belonging and so on. Okay, so the identity and the ideas are not given, but they are socially constructed. That's another thing which constructivism actually emphasizes on. So constructivism does focus on the construction of identity, which might happen for different reasons, and they might have different explanations. For example, the psychological factors might affect the changes in identity. So, for example, if a particular society has been in war for a very long time, then it would be very difficult for them further, or say the identity is built up around that idea of victimization, around that idea of being constantly oppressed. So that means that actually this particular society or this particular group might be less prone to peaceful relations and so on. If we're talking about the constructivism applied to relationships between the states, or let's say to identities of the states in terms of in terms of how they interact, you could, in this case, you could ask yourself two questions while analyzing let's say, for example, if you want to analyze the relationship between China and the US, right? So you will normally, and you want to apply that analysis in terms of identity, you could ask two questions: how close they are in terms of their identities, and how do they see each other? As enemies? Do they see each other as enemies or friends? And according, let's say, based on this, you'll actually be able to make your own, let's say, make a comparative analysis and see what exactly would be the background in terms of the identity. So, for instance, if you're going to, you can apply the same two questions if you want to analyze the current clashes between the Israeli forces and Palestinian forces. So, according to constructivism, there are four types of identities which shape the distribution of identities in IR. Internal identity would be the state's perception of itself, derived from individual self-reflection and national memory. So, in this case, we're talking about the history, about the let's say mainly about the history of the state, how exactly did the events develop, what is the political structure of the country, what exactly would be the, for example, you could analyze the state from the perspective of the ethnicities that are living in there and identify whether the state or the country is a multinational and heterogeneous, or is it a homogeneous society? Another type of identity could be an external identity. So that's the perception of the state by others, derived from historical relationship with other states. Relative identities would argue that that would include the actor's self-image in respect to one another based on similarities and differences. So, for example, the states might choose to cooperate or might choose to be in war based on how close their identity are, based on how similar their culture are, or the political structure, and so on. And shared identities would be aspects of identities that overlap and further, and like how do they overlap, and where exactly this particular state can cooperate with one another. Any questions up to this point, John?
None so far, miss.
Right. So you could bring in criticisms from mainly from liberalism and new realism. One of the biggest criticism is from both theories is that actually they did not really bring in anything new, and they just borrowed certain ideas. So for liberalism and new realism, actually constructivism is not quite valid. Then there are some particular things which you could emphasize on. So, for example, liberalism focuses on the process of democratization and interdependence and international institutions, and this can serve as an explanation to constructivism identity topic in terms of why states decide to cooperate, for example. New realists would criticize, are very quite skeptical in terms of what exactly, or let's say, how constructivism are analyzing the processes in the world system. And for constructivism, for new realism, they don't really understand why constructivism emphasizes so much on international norms. So technically, the constructive, let's say, you can apply constructivism while analyzing the international law, for example. So in this case, neorealism will come as a criticism in terms that well, the norms exist and the international law exists, but the states will normally use it in their own interests. Another theory which does not really come very often in the second semester, but which can actually, I would say, it's quite easy to understand and analyze, is the peace studies. So peace studies itself will challenge the notions surrounding a state's action, and peace studies also focuses on somewhere individual to domestic level of analysis. So for peace studies, the main focus is going to not just be on the spread of peace, like the way it was in the liberalism, but they want also to make the government subscribe to those ideas, and to reduce the militarist culture around the world. So if you want to, for example, analyze whether international law has moved towards the global governance, you can explain it from the perspective of peace studies, for the simple reason that peace studies is actually focusing on the analysis, we'll say, on the analysis of the effectiveness of those global institutions that were created around the world, and how exactly, let's say, the local communities or some local agencies do respond to it. So in terms of the topics discussed by peace studies, first and foremost, they do focus on the idea of the conflict resolution, and for them, the best way to sort out a conflict is to find a mediator, which can help to negotiate and resolve that dispute. So according to peace study scholars, there might be more than one mediator. Some regional conflicts are mediated through regional organizations or single states or even private individuals. So in this case, you can see that it is the idea of conflict resolution, or the way the process of the conflict resolution is quite close to the agenda of peace. So if you want to have a look at the let's say, if you want to have some examples, you could use the agenda of peace. From the perspective of peace studies, they are going to emphasize actually on that preventative diplomacy as and mediation or peacemaking as a tool to sort out the conflict as well. Peace studies also focuses, or let's say analyzes the topic of militarism, and for them this is the glorification of war, military force and violence through TV, movies, books, political speeches, and so on and so forth. So for them, militarism would occur when a country would structure their society around war by developing or by maintaining a high level of military industrial potential, promoting the adverts that would contain violent content, promoting the let's say militarism itself by, for example, organizing parades and so on. So for peace studies compared to liberalism, for example, the peace can be achieved by simply reducing that military industrial potential and changing the approach in terms of having this content related to military actions. So as an alternative to militarism, peace studies proposes the idea of positive peace. So for them, the positive peace would refer to ways of finding out the roots of the conflict itself. And for them, they consider that it's not enough to have a ceasefire. It is also important to further monitor and develop those relations. So if you compare it to agenda of peace, you can see that the peace building itself actually is having quite close connection to the topic of positive peace. Peace studies also emphasizes on the idea of the world government. So for them, the world government may be impractical or undesirable because it adds another layer of centralized control when peace demands decentralization and freedom. But without the world government, according to peace studies, the world might actually end up being in anarchy. So that leads to security dilemma, and that might actually have negative impacts later on, leading to major wars or conflicts. And another thing which we emphasized on is that peace studies focuses on domestic and individual level of analysis. And one of the core topics which they discuss are the peace movements. The peace movements can be done through protests, which would be, of course, peaceful, and for peace studies scholars, the main idea behind peace movements would be peaceful protests against the war or militarism. And if, in terms of examples, you could give the example of Mahatma Gandhi, who actually led the people, the Indians, to independence from British Empire, and there could be many more other examples. Again, if you want to read an extended version of peace studies, I recommend you to go to Joshua Goldstein. Any questions about this?
None so far, miss.
All right. So in terms of postmodernism, I need to find actually a little bit of time, and I could bring some online resources from the other book. But you have postmodernism very well explained in the slides. I will just go through generic topics. So, in terms of postmodernism, again, similar to peace studies, postmodernism focuses on somewhere, I would say, actually, postmodernism itself has quite a wide area of action, and it might actually, I would say, it mostly focuses on domestic level of analysis, but it can be also applied to interstate or individual level of analysis, depends on what exactly you are analyzing. However, the best thing to do in terms of choosing some theories to analyze particular ideas, it would be to use it on domestic level of analysis. So first and foremost, or the core idea behind the postmodernism is that the states are not the most important actors of IR. The states, according to postmodernism, are fictions, and the attention is shifted towards the non-state actors. Technically, postmodernism is one of the first theories which directly emphasizes on the non-state actors or the role of the non-state actors. So the central idea of postmodernism is that there is no single objective reality, so each society around the world will have, or let's say, will live their own experiences. For example, if we compare, again, if we're going to compare the situation in Israel nowadays, right? If let's say if you would look at the armament or the military industrial potential from the both sides, you could see that first and foremost is an asymmetric warfare, right? So it is the war itself or the attacks themselves are led or held mostly in the civilian areas, in cities, and so on. Another thing which you can notice is that, let's say, Israel, for example, is using the latest technology in terms of protection. The Palestinian side is using, I would say, has quite high number of rockets that are sent, but there's little impact, right? So for the and this impact from the postmodernist perspective would actually help you to understand that the civilians, for example, if you're going to take into account the civilians in Palestine and civilians in Israel will live the same reality in different way, because the Palestinian side the Palestinian population will feel less safe. The Israeli population will feel, safe in terms of the fact that they know that there is this iron dome that protects them from attacks and so on. Does it make sense?
Yep.
All right. Then there are some, let's say there are for NCK you need to technically know two major components of the postmodernism, and this is you need to be able to analyze the role of the state. So as I mentioned, states are fictions. They're constructed to make sense of the actions of a large number of individuals. So if you compare postmodernism to realism, for example, you can see there that actually realism emphasizes a lot on the state sovereignty, territoriality, and so on and so forth. Whereby for postmodernism, they do not think that emphasizing on a particular territory is a valid variable in terms of and analyzing some events, because for postmodernism, for instance, why the state is a fiction, for the simple reason that let's say certain nations are not really having are not able to have a state, they're not able to actually build up their own nationhood, and they're dispersed among different other nation states. So in this case, for instance, we can bring, I think I've brought this example many times, but we could bring the example of Kurdish population, which is dispersed among four different countries, and you could see that there is a little bit more of independence in terms of actions taken by the Kurds in Syria, for example, in Iraq, rather than the Kurds that are located in Turkey and Iran, where the state is able to control their actions and is able to stop their actions, like for example separatist actions or some actions in terms of self-determination from their own territories. So the stories told about the actions and policies of the states are just stories. So you could here you could actually say that postmodernism emphasizes on language that is used in terms of explaining particular events. So this is why it is very important, for instance, to have a look at different sources when you're analyzing particular events. You might see certain sources that are biased towards a particular, might take sides in terms of their in terms of the ideas they support. Another thing, and in terms of, if you're talking about the language, one tool which the postmodernism uses is the deconstruction. So from the perspective of postmodernism, deconstruction refers to the text deconstruction. So technically you could take, for example, an article, or let's say you can take 3 or 4 articles from 3 or 4 different media sources, for example, Al Jazeera, BBC, Russia Today, and maybe some other source, and on the same topic, for example, on the topic of, I don't know, of the situation between Israel and Palestine. And you can actually see that the some of the media, let's say the text, might actually include different codes. Depends on the meanings that are put in the text itself, in the title of the text, and so on. That could actually have a huge impact into how the event might further develop. Postmodernism is a very good critique. Also, you can bring lots of criticism from the postmodernist perspective towards realism, and because they do criticize realism for bias and lack of objectivity. Why do they emphasize on that? Is because first and foremost, realism focuses on the idea of the power politics, so it is biased towards the states that are more powerful. Second, realism from the perspective of postmodernism, realism cannot be considered objective for the simple reason that it actually does not really analyze a wide range of variables, and it only focuses on the state-to-state relations. And again, returning to the previous point about the role of the state, from the perspective of postmodernism, the states are fictions. So this is exactly why we have these two tools. If we're talking about the postmodernism, there are there are two main, let's say, branches of postmodernism in realism, which can be used to analyze the events, and that is post-structuralism and post-colonialism. You could also include here uh, the structural feminism, right? So you could actually have the you could actually have this situations, or say the events explained from the perspective, or say specifically from a particular perspective. So, for example, if we're talking about post-structuralism, if we're talking about post-structuralism, we're going to actually focus on the um, we're going to focus on the idea of how the states, for example, again, on the idea of the role of the states, on the deconstruction. You could also focus on the you could also have the you could also analyze the discourse of particular leaders. How do they talk about certain events in the world? How they analyze particular how do they analyze particular let's say situations in the world system, and so on. If we're talking about post-colonialism, you could actually, like for example, any events that are related to the post-colonial world is actually a very, or let's say you could actually very well analyze it from the perspective of post-colonialism. Somewhere, post-colonialism is kind of a mix between the postmodernism and the Marxist perspective, because postcolonialism somehow emphasizes um, on the inequality and so on. However, postcolonialism would criticize Marxism for being too Eurocentric. So postcolonialism mainly focuses on the situations that happened in the post-colonial world, and mainly, let's say, if you want to analyze, for example, the current, let's say, the responses to the terrorist attacks or the reasons for the terrorism to emerge, you could actually explain anything related to the global south using post-colonialism itself. Now, if we're talking about the feminism, we can have, or let's say, um, you can find the full slides on feminism. There is a separate slide. I think there are around 20 slides if you want to have more information about it. I've put in here just some brief information. So first and foremost, what you have to remember is that feminism is part of gender theories, and somehow similar to postmodernism, it actually takes a lot of their knowledge from literature, psychology, history, and so on. In international relations, feminism actually gained more interest towards the end of 80s. And one aspect of feminism is that they're trying to explain why gender is important in understanding how IR works. And another focus which or let's say another focus of feminism in international relations is would include the issues like war and international security. So from the feminist perspective, main assumptions of realism show the way in which men tend to interact with the world. So technically, feminism in international relations took the role of a woman on the next level, let's say so, and technically emphasizes on how For example, ensuring gender equality could shift the world system towards a more peaceful society. We can identify three main types of feminism. First and foremost could be different feminism. Difference feminism would see the war as a masculine quest, and from the historical perspective, feminism argues that men are always seen as hunters and combatants in war. So in history, men were also the first one who got the right to vote or to maintain leadership position. And difference feminism also argues that women are not really interested to start a war, and they could actually could adapt easier to peace because they have that experience of being mothers, right? In terms of behavior of women, or let's say how the woman would play a role in wartime. In Liberia, in 90s, there were long-term civil wars, so women organized protests to support peace and to stop actually the, let's say, the losses in terms of the men. Liberal feminism would criticize the difference feminism, and it focuses on the idea that the men and women are equal, so you can have that emphasizing that idea of the gender equality. And they also argue that the role between the men and women are based on what would be their role in the decision-making process itself, or say where do they stand in terms of position. The liberal feminism also criticizes other theories that the women are not having leadership position in world politics, and another thing which they argue is that even if women will gain more power in terms of being represented in the world politics, still there is little that will be changed, for the simple reason that the system itself needs to be changed. And postmodern feminism would criticize both of these theories, and they would consider that the gender is important but flexible. And if you're going to go to the main slides, you will actually have a lot more information about it. They from postmodernist feminism, postmodern feminists, they would reject fully realism and some other approaches like liberalism, somewhere constructivism, and they will give importance to the protection of women and their supporters. So technically, postmodernism emphasizes on those women rights movements, agencies, and so on. Postmodern feminism is using abstract concepts and rules and does not analyze the wealth, like, for example, Marxism. And it mostly emphasizes on that historical development of the role of men and women, how did it change, what would be the impacts, and so on. So, yeah, that is all in terms of the theories. And if you have any questions, please do ask.
Miss, one more thing. What is the difference between difference feminism and postmodern feminism?
Well, okay, difference feminism. Okay, let's just move back here. First and foremost, if we're talking about difference feminism, you can find somehow difference feminism as a mix between the neo-realist and constructivist concepts. Okay, the difference feminism does not really criticize the realism, rather it explains why exactly, for example, a war happened. It explains that the reasons why the war happened is because the world was ruled by men, and because the men themselves are more prone to war, to start a war. Postmodern feminism focuses on the idea of gender and the idea of how let's say, of women empowerment in terms of, let's say, analyzing how historically women actually gained that power. How did the discourse change around this, the women rights, for example? It focuses, postmodernism itself focuses on the role of the NGOs and focuses somehow on the role of women leaders, right? So you could say that, let's say, it actually shows a different dimension of analysis itself. Okay, makes sense, more or less.
Yes, miss. Thank you.
Any other questions?
None that I can think of, miss.
All right, if you have any questions, John, just let me know. I mean, you can ask me tomorrow after the exam itself, or just drop me a message and